Okay, good morning, Year 11. So we are going to record a video today for Macbeth for the exam. This will take you through every key scene, look at the characters, analyse some quotations. It will be quite long, so don't think you have to do it all in one sitting. You can pause the video, work on some tasks, use Cornell notes, whatever you like, but it will be quite a long one, so you may need to pause it and come back to it at a later point. Okay, so assessment objective A03 asks you to consider the historical context. So these are the main things that you need to know. So the play was written in 1606 and was written during the Jacobean era, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it's set in 1040 in medieval Scotland. So firstly, let's consider the Jacobean era. So Queen Elizabeth died in 1603 with no children and no possible person to succeed her. So the throne was offered to James Stuart, who became James I. He'd ruled under a Scottish Protestant regime, and that made him an acceptable king for England because England was firmly a Protestant country, and he was a distant relation of Elizabeth, so therefore he was considered appropriate. However, this did cause controversy because some people didn't agree that he should have been king, and this led to the Gunpowder Plot. So Elizabeth I and James I. So Shakespeare was writing for the theatre during the reigns of the two monarchs, Queen Elizabeth and King James. So he was writing for both those monarchs. The plays he wrote during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, such as A Midsummer Night's Dream, are often seen to embody the optimistic mood of the Elizabethans. However, those that he wrote during James's reign, such as Macbeth and Hamlet, are darker and more cynical, reflecting the insecurities of the Jacobean period. So remember, James was very paranoid, he was worried about witches, he was constantly worried about being murdered, and Macbeth definitely reflects that. So what was the Gunpowder Plot? So certain Catholics, like obviously the ones that you know, like Guy Fawkes, turned to terrorism during James I's Protestant rule, trying to blow up the Houses of Parliament in 1605. Macbeth was written the year after the Gunpowder Plot and was considered a piece of propaganda in support of King James. So the message of the play very much was perpetrators of regicide will eventually receive their comeuppance. The conspirators were betrayed and horribly tortured on the rack until they confessed. They were then executed in the most brutal fashion as a warning to all other would-be traitors. Shakespeare's Macbeth wove direct references to the plot, including King James's snake and the flower medal. So they very much be the serpent, be the innocent flower. What was the divine right of kings? So whilst the present Queen claims constitutional impartiality, in the European Middle Ages, the divine right of kings was a dominant concept. So the idea claimed that kings were answerable only to God, and it was therefore treachery to challenge them. To kill the king, to commit regicide, was to challenge the direct authority of God and was considered an unforgivable sin. James I ruled under the notion of the divine rights of kings, so very much that was in play during this era. So Shakespeare and James I was very much a cautionary tale for James I, which is why it was considered propaganda, warning any other potential regicide, so king killers, of the awful fate for this crime. Macbeth's victim, King Duncan, is presented by Shakespeare as a noble, divinely appointed ruler. Killing Duncan has catastrophic consequences for Macbeth and Scotland. So Duncan could be a representation of James, but might also lead to King Edward's healing the sick. Such sanctity hath heaven given his hand. So Lady Macbeth and the role of women is a massive theme. So Jacobean society was patriarchal, much like the majority of Western history. Female characters in Shakespearean tragedies were often passive, whereas Lady Macbeth is a cunning, manipulative and dominant woman who is associated with the supernatural. So her introduction at 1 scene 5, when she's reading Macbeth's letter, she shows very much that she's subverting submission. So when she stops reading Macbeth's letter, she criticises nature. She says he's too full of the milk of human kindness, and this behaviour would have been considered very controversial within the societal confines of a masculine kind of era. So she was very radical at the time, and we have spoken in class about the idea of, you know, she kind of goes against the structure of society before Macbeth does. She very much represents a breakaway from this patriarchal society. So Macbeth was actually a real person. He was 11th century Scottish king, but he was heavily adjusted to fit this story. So the one in the 11th century had a valid right to the throne, and he actually reigned for a significant period of time, not just a few short weeks. He did succeed Duncan, whom he had defeated in battle, but the real Duncan was a weak and younger, ignoble king. So in reality, Macbeth was succeeded by his own stepson, not Malcolm, who came to the throne later. So Banquo is a mythical figure. Shakespeare found his version of the story of Macbeth in the Chronicles of Holland's Head, if you want to look that up. So religious beliefs was very important in the Middle Ages, and they upheld this great chain of being, which is the thing that Lady Macbeth kind of breaks. So this was the belief that God had designed an ordered system for both nature and humankind, within which every creature and person had an allotted place. It was considered an offence against God for anyone to try and alter their station in life, which Lady Macbeth does. So in addition, madness was often seen as a moral issue, either a punishment for a sin or a test in faith and character. So one of our theories that we've talked about in class is that Lady Macbeth actually breaks that chain of being right from the start, and therefore she's punished with insanity and she commits suicide because she's gone against this patriarchal chain of being. I'm not going to go through every single one of the terms on this glossary, so you might want to pause the video now and make sure that you understand what these techniques are. There are certain ones that are massively important to the play, so things like a catalyst. So we've talked about how the three witches propel Macbeth's ambition. The idea of hubris, which is excessive pride, which inevitably leads to one's downfall. The idea of the patriarchy, of regicide. So pause the video now and make sure that you know what these techniques are and where they apply in the play. So these are the key characters in the play and the ones that you could likely get a question on. You've got Macbeth, and he is at the start of the play a Scottish general and the Thane of Glamis, which he got that title from his father, and he obviously meets the witches and he's greeted by the prophecies that he is eventually going to be, you know, the Thane of Coulsor and then eventually king. And this, when this comes true, that acts as the catalyst that makes his ambition come to light. So he longs to become king and is then tempted to murder Duncan to achieve that goal. Remember, this ambition has existed long before he met the witches. This is an ambition him and Lady Macbeth have talked about previously. So he very much wanted to be king. So Lady Macbeth does manipulate him, but only partially. So he becomes king of Scotland, but he's not a virtuous king. He's brilliant on the battlefield, but is ill-suited to being king, actually, and he very quickly becomes a tyrant. He becomes suspicious of everyone, even his closest friends like Banquo, and his response to every problem that he comes across is violence and murder. He's never comfortable in his role as a criminal or as king. He doesn't know what his place is, and this leads to kind of a psychological regression, and he just becomes a tyrant. Lady Macbeth is a deeply complicated character. She's an ambitious woman, she's a loving woman, and she lusts for power and position, and I'm not convinced it's for herself. She very much wants it for her husband, but she very much, her Hamasha is also ambitious as well. So early in the play, she seems to be stronger and more ruthless of the two, as she urges her husband to kill Duncan and to seize the crown. And after the bloodshed begins, Lady Macbeth falls victim to guilt and madness to even greater degree than than her husband. So remember, the great chain of being felt that madness was a punishment for usurping the natural order. Her conscience affects her to such an extent that she eventually commits suicide. So interestingly, she and Macbeth are presented as being deeply in love, and many of Lady Macbeth's speeches imply that her influence over her husband is primarily sexual, so very much she controls him that way. However, remember, I always feel quite sad at the end of the play when she's trying to get him to bed, she's trying to look after him. I do think their love was quite real. So their joint alienation from the world seems to strengthen the attachment they feel to each other, so they feel quite separate and other. Banquo is equally as brave and noble and skilled in battle as Macbeth. Okay, so remember, both of them were lauded as impressive on the battlefield. his prediction, the prophecy, is that his children will become kings. He won't become king, but his children will be. So like Macbeth, Banquo thinks ambitious thoughts, but he does not translate those thoughts into action. However, there is a sense that maybe if he'd lived a little bit longer, perhaps he might have done that. So Banquo's character acts as a foil to Macbeth. He represents the path Macbeth chose not to take, a path in which ambition need not lead to betrayal and murder. Appropriately then, it is Banquo's ghost and not Duncan's that haunts Macbeth. In addition to embodying Macbeth's guilt for killing Banquo, the ghost also reminds Macbeth that he did not emulate Banquo's reaction to the witch's prophecy. Okay, so remember, Banquo is one of the characters and the scene with the ghost that might come up in the exam, so be prepared for that. Macduff is another character foil. He mirrors Macbeth in every way as well, except Macduff has a wife and children. Macbeth has no children. They've got a similar name, just like the betrayer MacDonald at the opening, which indicates that they're closely connected. He is a Scottish nobleman and he's hostile to Macbeth's kingship from the start. He suspects him, which arguably shows he would make a good king, because unlike Duncan, he recognises his betrayal. He eventually becomes a leader of the crusade to unseat Macbeth. The Crusade's mission is to place the rightful King Malcolm on the throne, but Macduff also desires vengeance for Macbeth's murder of Macduff's wife and young son. And remember, he's the character at the end that Macbeth will not fight, largely because he thinks he's shed too much of his blood already. King Duncan is a good king of Scotland. He's fair and he's noble, he's virtuous, benevolent. However, he doesn't recognise betrayers, and he's also putting the country in a very precarious position because two armies have come to fight Macbeth at the start. So his death symbolises the destruction of an order in Scotland that can be restored only when Duncan's line, the person of Malcolm, once more occupies the throne. So Malcolm is the son of Duncan, and he's the innocent virgin, remember, at the end in his conversation with Macduff. He flees initially, but then he creates his own army and goes to fight against Macbeth. And you've got the three witches. Remember, they're the weird sisters, which shows that they are part of fate. They cannot they can manipulate circumstances, but they can't force Macbeth to do anything against his will. So they're merely manipulators. Okay, so this is just a brief summary of what happens in each act. You can find many of these available online. This one's from Gradesaver, but we've just got a breakdown of what happens in each scene. So obviously Act 1 is very much the witches, the battle, the letter saying that Macbeth is on his way and that he's been promised the throne, and the kind of plan to kill Duncan. So Act 2 is very much the lead up to Duncan's death. You've got the bloody dagger, you've got the murder, the ringing of the bells, the actual regicide, the porter scene, followed by the murder of the guards and Malcolm and Donalbain fleeing while Macbeth is crowned king. In Act 3, kind of the climax of the play, Macbeth is very much in the throes of trying to thwart the prophecy. He kills Banquo and tries to kill Fleance. Lady Macbeth, their relationship is very much falling apart. You've got the banquet scene where the ghost appears, and it's very much everything starts to fall apart in this scene. In this act. Act 4, Macbeth goes back to see the witches, and we see the three apparitions. One warns him against Macduff. The second one tells him to not fear any man from woman born, and the third talks about Burnham Wood moving to Dunsinane and gives him kind of a sense of confidence. But Samartia kicks in as well, and he asks about Banquo, and they basically tell him that Banquo's children will still be king. And in Act 5, it's very much the end of things. Lady Macbeth is sleepwalking, and then she commits suicide. You've got Macbeth murders young Seaward. He talks about being trapped. We've then got the final scenes with Macduff, his murder, and well, no, it's not his murder, his death, and then he comes on, and Macduff comes on stage holding Macbeth's head. So you can read that in more detail if you can put that into a big screen. These are on the right hand side. You've got the themes that you want to be able to talk about. So you can pause the video now and have a look at those rather than me go through each one. Okay, some key quotations here that are well worth memorising for your exam. The symbol of hands that runs through. Macbeth says, will all the water in the ocean wash this blood from my hands, in Act 2, Scene 2. And then later on, you've got Lady Macbeth talking about out damn spot, and how all the perfume in Arabia would not cleanse her hands as well. So you can look at the theme of hands. The dagger is a massive symbol of Macbeth. We've talked about what the dagger represents, the fact that it's a concealed weapon, the fact that it suggests treachery. You've got this idea of, whether it's real, is it supernatural, has it come from his mind? Macbeth recognises immediately that it's not real, and he chooses to interpret it as a symbol that he should kill Duncan. The concept of the crown, the concept of kingship, which I'll do a detailed video on later on, but the idea of the divine right of kings, and that he sees that incorrectly later on. We find out very much that he's afraid of Banquo because Banquo seems much more the natural king, and he very much feels like a player, someone pretending to be king. Double toil and trouble. Pick that one out because remember, the witches are equivocators. They speak in double speak. They don't answer questions directly. They answer truthfully, but those answers can be manipulated, can be taken in different ways. The idea of childbirth, so fear not, Macbeth, no man that's born of woman shall ever have power upon thee. So again, that's very much the idea of the witches being equivocators. They haven't lied, but Macbeth was not born of woman, he was born by caesarean section. One of the best quotes in the play, because it ties into the religious analogy: look like the innocent flower but be the serpent underneath it, following the Garden of Eden story and the temptation of Eve and Adam. And this quote here, one of my favourites: out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And in the end, after Lady Macbeth's death, Macbeth becomes very nihilistic, and he believes that he's been controlled by fate, and nothing he does or did change, the events of his life. And Lady Macbeth's quote, unsex me here come thick night, and pull thee in the dunner smoke of hell. Remember, she's taken away all her gender. She wants to be evil in that moment. So those are some of the key quotes that are worth memorising for the exam. You should be able to use them in a lot of different essay questions. Okay, so let's look at some key quotations. So on the top one, we have got from Act 1, Scene 5, lines 36 to 52, and that is Lady Macbeth's speech, where she's talking about the raven himself being hoarse, and she leads into the come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here. So let's look at some of those key lines. So the raven himself is hoarse, that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements. So here the raven represents death and evil power, as it is dark and ominous. He croaks hoarsely as Duncan's imminent death comes closer. It uses the technique foreshadowing to create an eerie expectation that Duncan, the king, will soon be facing danger and trouble. Duncan's fatal entrance will come when he enters her estate, her battlements. This line reference to a raven is quite significant, as it foreshadows the violence that's to come. The raven is mentioned to be hoarse, which shows that its strength is impaired and is being silenced to hush the terrors that are coming. The raven is also a messenger bird, therefore, and may perhaps regard to the messenger who delivered the letter Macbeth wrote to his wife, with also the news of the king arriving at their estate very soon. So when she says, come you spirits, unsex me here, fill me from the crown to the toe top of direst cruelty, she's calling on, evil spirits that tempt her evil thoughts to come forward and fill her body with cruelty. So she knows exactly what she's asking for at this point. She wants to remove herself of the ladylike features she owns, such as motherly instincts and the supposedly very feminine setbacks she insists she has, and fill her with courage and manly strength that will allow her to commit the cruel and unspeakable act that she has plans to commit. Interestingly, this doesn't work, because just a few scenes later she says she can't kill Duncan because he looked like her father. She says, make thick my blood, let nature not shake my fell purpose, nor keep the peace between the effects and it. So she calls on the spirits that can thicken her blood and strength to stop the reasoning, worry and fear of her natural self, and might stop her from delivering her evil plan. She talks about taking her milk for gall, and milk is obviously a key image throughout the play. It represents cowardice and weakness, and she's making some sort of prayer to help her actually commit murder with her husband. So in doing this, she needs to feel sorry guys, been doing this for a while now today. So in doing this, she feels she needs to remove all womanly softness and care. So she wants to remove her motherly characteristics, her ability to breastfeed, and she asks for the evil spirits to fill it with gall, which is known as bile. That's the product that that causes vomit. And she then calls on the night, come thick night, and she wants to pall thee in the dunnest smoke of hell. So in this phrase, Lady Macbeth asks upon the night to hide her deed from both heaven and God's eyes, and from herself and other people. She asks that the night's shade covers the estate, and nobody can see her do the evil deed, as she'll be punished severely by God. She feels as though if nobody sees her crime, it will simply go away and she will feel no guilt, as it never happened. And obviously we know that doesn't happen, and in the end she's upset that she can't see the stars anymore and she can't see God's light, which is why she's carrying around the candle in the end. The second speech I've got there is from Macbeth, and this is one of his soliloquies. So you'll see this in Act 1 Scene 7 before he kills Duncan, and it's his internal kind of monologue, his debate as to whether he should do that. So he lists Duncan's noble qualities and the loyalty he feels towards his king, and he reminds us that he's there in double trust. He's his kinsman and his subject, and he's reminding the audience and himself how grave and serious it would be if they slaughtered their ruler while he's a guest in their house. So the divine right of kings, the great chain of being. So at the same time, Macbeth worries, we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions, which being taught return to plague the inventor. It foreshadows the way his deeds will eventually come back to haunt him, so he knows that going in. So the imagery in the speech is very dark, which mirrors Lady Macbeth's speech. He talks about bloody instructions, deep damnation, the poisoned chalice. She was talking about poisoning her breast milk, and it suggests that Macbeth is aware of how the murder would open the door to a dark and sinful world, and it very much does. Once he kills Duncan, he immediately kills the guards, and he just keeps slaughtering everybody until the end of the play. So at the same time, he admits that his only reason for committing murder is ambition, his vaulting ambition, and suddenly that seems like a really insufficient justification for the act. So we have talked about this quite often, that Duncan was a weak king in terms of protecting the country, because two armies have come to attack Macbeth and Banquo. So the justification for killing him is there. However, he's only killing him not to protect the country, but to because he wants to be king. So therefore his unchecked ambition has to be checked, and eventually he has to be got rid of, because the only reason he did what he did was become king. So as the soliloquy ends, Macbeth seems to resolve not to kill Duncan, but this resolve will only last until his wife again returns and convinces him by the strength of her will to go ahead with their plot. After the death of Duncan, Macbeth immediately becomes quite stressed, and he comes down and he's talking to Lady Macbeth, and he's constantly hearing little noise. They prayed for silence, but now all they can hear is noise. So we've got the quote here at the top on the left is, whence is that knocking? How is it with me when every noise appalls me? What hands are here, ho, they pluck at mine eyes. And he talks about, will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas in Cardine, making the green one red. So Macbeth talks about very much his guilt here. He's just murdered Duncan, and the crime was accompanied by supernatural portents. So remember, when people arrive at the castle, they very much talk about how bad the weather's been and how strange the night has been and all the strange, ominous things that have been happening. So now he hears a mysterious knocking on the gate, which seems to promise doom. So actually it's Macduff knocking, which foreshadows that, his death. It foreshadows that Macduff has come from Macbeth. So the enormity of Macbeth's crime has awakened him a powerful sense of guilt that will hound him throughout the play. Blood, specifically Duncan's blood, serves as the symbol of this guilt, and Macbeth's sense that all great Neptune's ocean cannot cleanse him, that there is enough blood in his hands to turn the entire sea red, will stay with him until his death. Lady Macbeth's response to this speech will be her prosaic remark, a little water clears up this deed, but by the end of the play, she's very much the one constantly stressed and screaming, out damn Spot, which is the second quote. So in Act 5, Scene 1, we've got the famous quote, out, damn Spot, out, I say. And she's sleepwalking through the castle because Macbeth has murdered Sleep. And this is on the eve of his battle against Macduff and Malcolm. So things are very much starting to fall apart at this point. So earlier in the play, she was completely resolved to commit the murder. She had a real sense of purpose in her ambition, and she was very much the driving force behind their plot to kill Duncan. So when Macbeth believed his hand was irreversibly bloodstained early in the play, Lady Macbeth kind of poo-pooed him, saying, a little water clears up as this deed. However, now at the end of the play, she too sees the blood and she can't remove it. It's a spot though. It's like she's recognised the part that she's had to play as minor, but it stained her soul. She's completely undone by guilt and she descends into madness. Again, the great chain of being said that was a punishment for trying to break the system. So it may be a reflection of her mental and emotional state that she is not speaking in verse here. So this is one of the moments in the play foreshadowed. This is one of the major moments in the play when a major character, except for the witches who speak in couplets, strays from iambic pentameter. So her inability to sleep was foreshadowed in the voice that her husband thought he heard while killing the king, a voice crying out that Macbeth was murdering Sleep. And her delusion that there is a bloodstain on her hand further the play's use of blood as a symbol of guilt. What need we fear? Who knows it when? None can call our powers to account, she asks, asserting that as long as her and her husband's power is secure, the murders they committed cannot harm them. But her guilt-racked state and her mounting madness show how hollow her words are. So too does the army outside her castle. Hell is murky, she says, implying that she already knows that darkness intimately. The pair, in their destructive power, have created their own hell, where they are tormented by guilt and insanity. Macbeth's response to her death, she should have died hereafter, is subject to much debate. So, given the great love between them, his response seems oddly muted. However, his tone completely shifts at this point, and he becomes very nihilistic, and he delivers his final soliloquy of one of pessimism and despair. And it's one of the most famous speeches in all of Shakespeare, this idea of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And we've talked about that triplet there and how it really emphasises grief and how he feels like his life is going to be endlessly miserable without her. So his speech insists that there is no meaning or purpose in life. Rather, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. One can easily understand how, with his wife dead and armies marching against them, Macbeth succumbs to such pessimism. Yet there is also a defensive and self-justifying quality to his words. If everything is meaningless, then Macbeth's awful crimes are somehow made less awful, because like everything else, they too signify nothing. Macbeth's statement that life is but a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage can be read as Shakespeare's somewhat deflating reminder of the illusionary nature of the theatre, After all, Macbeth is only a player himself, strutting on the Elizabethan stage. In any play, there is a conspiracy of sorts between the audience and the actors, as both pretend to accept the play's reality. Macbeth's comment calls to attention this conspiracy and partially explodes it. His nihilism embraces not only his own life, but the entire play. If we take his words to heart, the play too can be seen as an event full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So at the bottom there, you've got some example questions that you can have a go at answering for your revision. So pause the video now and perhaps pick one of those and see how you would respond. I'm not going to read this to you because you're perfectly capable of doing that for yourself, but I want to pick out some key things here. So we've got this question: explain how far you think Shakespeare presents Lady Macbeth as a powerful woman. And what you'll notice is the things that I've highlighted. So we're very much talking about the author's intention. Shakespeare presents, Shakespeare intends. We make sure that we're answering the question, so you can see powerful highlighted in red throughout, and references to femininity and defeminization and her feminine side. So you need to make sure in each point that you make that you're answering that question. They are short, judicious quotations picked out in blue, and things that have been highlighted are language techniques like imperatives and references to the context, so such things as matriarchal, tyranny, foreshadowing. So pause the video and read the response for yourself, and then if you want to, as revision, you could have a go at answering the question that I put in the blue box at the bottom. Explore how Shakespeare presents the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and see how you would answer that. What extract would you pick to analyse, and then what points would you make? Okay, let's get to it. So I'm going to go through each scene in detail. I've only been able to pick a short extract, which you'll see on the left on each slide, because I won't be able to fit the whole thing there. But it will go through each scene until the end of the play. So Act 1, Scene 1 is the introduction of the three witches. We've got the foreshadowing of thunder and lightning, suggesting that something bad is about to come, and the theme of witchcraft and the supernatural is introduced. It would very much have gripped the Jacobean audience at this point. So at the end of the scene, we've got the witches that say, "When shall we three meet again?" which foreshadows that an event is about to occur or something's about to happen. And one of the key themes that's represented here is the difference between appearance and reality. So remember, they are equivocators. They don't tell the truth, but they also don't lie. So some key quotes here are hurly-burly, this busy, boisterous activity. So they'll meet when the hurly-burly is done, when the battle is lost and won. And there's a mention there that obviously that this idea of perpetual war, there's always going to be a battle that's going on. They speak in oxymorons: fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air, which creates this sense of this dark supernatural tone. They use rhyming couplets, which firmly embeds them in this idea of being witches and witchcraft. It's very nursery rhyming style. Remember that style of poetry, that style of writing is often subversive, and they're very much set the scene for the rest of the play. Okay, they ominous, they foreshadow this idea of a warning or an indication of a future event. So that's Act 1, Scene 1. Act 1, Scene 2, this is when the wounded sergeant or captain has come back from battle, and he tells Duncan what has happened, and he delivers this speech saying that Macbeth and Banquo are, have been amazing. They're described through their actions in battle, through the other Scottish noblemen presented as these amazing heroes. It's important that Macbeth's character has been introduced through the other opinions of other people, because it shows how impressive he is and how good he is at this point. However, there's always the indication that he is He's violent and there's an undertone of violence that goes through. He's well respected because of that violence, and that's what he gets called brave for. He's saying he deserves that name, even though he smoked with bloody execution. He's this strong warrior. He carved a path through the rebel forces and found Macdonald the traitor and unseamed him from the belly, you know, from the nave to the chaps, and chopped his head off and put it on a stake. So these qualities are admired by the sergeant or by the captain, and his brutality is praiseworthy, but it does hint to the audience that he's got this undertone of negativity and potential for evil. This is how in the Jacobean era and, you know, the 11th century, that manhood was proven by proving oneself in battle, and that was considered a sign of courage and masculine prowess. Lady Macbeth doesn't really know what a good soldier he is because she doesn't see him on the battlefield, and she constantly accuses him of being a coward, which you can see then why his anger and his villainy gets out of control, because he takes his personality on the battlefield and moves it into his real life. You very much get the exposition of the story here. The Scottish nobleman, the current Thane of Cawdor, has betrayed Scotland and he's sided with the King of Norway in an attempt to invade, and he's stripped of his title, which is then given to Macbeth as a reward for his bravery. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Macdonald was a traitor and Macbeth ended up to be a traitor. You know, what he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won, which is interesting as well because it mirrors the witch's speech when the battle's lost and won. So it's very much this paradox, this disloyal, treasonous Thane of Cawdor, loyal, brave Macbeth, but then Macbeth becomes the Thane of Cawdor and then he becomes disloyal, treasonous. You have to wonder, is Macduff the person who's going to get that title next? So, however, the full character arc of Macbeth, as we follow his journey, reveals that they're actually very similar. Macbeth ultimately betrays his king and country, which foreshadows and echoes the event. And Macduff, by the end of the play, is also just like Macbeth, lost his wife, no children, because Macbeth murdered them all. Is Macduff now going to be the new Thane of Cawdor, and will the circle continue? Duncan orders Thane of Cawdor's Macdonald's death, and it's very, very lacking in emotion at this point. Act 1, Scene 3 is the reaction to the witches. So the witches give their kind of predictions, and then it's massively key as to how Macbeth and Banquo react to those prophecies. So if we look at the language of the three witches, even though they speak in couplets, they are rude, they're vulgar, they're shocking. They constantly reference animals which were considered lower than humans, and they're very much the epitome of what witches would have been. So one of the witches was away killing swine, one of the witches was offended by someone who wouldn't give her chestnuts, and she decides to punish her husband, who's a sailor, and she controls the winds and uses the power to disrupt his journey. It talks about how they can't actually interfere. His bark cannot be lost, but they can unsettle the ship, and they're going to drain him dry as hay. So they foreshadow there what they will eventually do Macbeth. So they can't, you know, they can manipulate Macbeth, but they can't actually interfere, but they do disrupt his journey. So if their prophecy was true, he would be king. Macbeth would have been king anyway. However, they disrupt how he gets there. He doesn't get to it in a natural way. Very much in this scene, we see the differences between Macbeth and Banquo. So Shakespeare uses Banquo as a contrast to Macbeth, reinforcing that Macbeth's tragedy is self-inflicted. You know, Banquo says, "Why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair?" Yeah, Banquo is surprised by Macbeth's reaction to the witches, the prophecy that would be king. It's not the first time Macbeth has had thoughts of becoming king, and his fear suggests his premeditated disposition. His thoughts turn to murder straight away, and that's why he starts so much. He's quite shocked. It's like they've seen what's deep in his brain, and it's that possibility that starts the vaulting ambition, that starts his fatal flaw. Banquo considers the witches' predictions as honest trifles, something that the supernatural, so he shouldn't pay too much attention. But Macbeth is deeply curious and has to find out more. It's very much a foreshadowing scene. So foul and fair a day I've not seen. Macbeth's speech almost repeats the words of the witch from the first scene, and this coincidence is ominous. The supernatural connotations is he being manipulated by the weird sisters, these agents of fate. At 1 Scene 4, we get the detail that the Thane of Cawdor, considered traitor, has now been executed, and the audience is told about how he died, and that's very important. So according to Malcolm, he died a good death, in contrast to how Macbeth takes on the title of Cawdor. So the audience already know that Macbeth is planning to kill Duncan. He said that, so we've got this sense of dramatic irony. Macbeth takes on the title of the worst traitor. Duncan, on previous Thane of Cawdor, is shown to be a poor judge of character. He was a man in whom I built an absolute trust, and it just reflects that he's about to make the same mistake again. This is the descent into Macbeth's journey into deception, evil and brutality, and it's already beginning well before he's discussed this with Lady Macbeth. Duncan heap praise on Macbeth for his part in the battle. My plenteous joys wanton in fullness seek to hide themselves in drops of sorrow. He's so happy he could cry. Macbeth's contrasting short, sharp sentences show that he is not on the same wavelength. So already his decision has almost been made. The contrast of the hyperbolic, overblown language of Duncan shows how naive he is and unaware of what's actually happening. He uses this to create a sense of anticipation with the audience. He heaps lavish praise on the man who wants to kill him. So the dramatic irony is intense in this scene. And Macbeth shows himself to be a complete liar. He says, the service and loyalty I owe in doing pays itself. He hides his real thoughts with false words. It's decided he will hide his treachery. He's duplicitous. Yeah, he's an equivocator. So for a bit of context, Scotland at the time, the king was allowed to name his successor. It didn't have to be in his family. Macbeth well could have been named as the future king. And this was to prevent fighting and disputes between noblemen in the family in case the king died suddenly. Obviously, Duncan ends up murdered. Duncan names his son Malcolm as his successor. He names him the Prince of Cumberland, and this seals Duncan's fate. Macbeth feels that now he has no choice but to kill Duncan and to be king, and he goes home to his wife after the announcement to prepare for the king and nobleman's impending visit. So he says, the Prince of Cumberland, the Prince of Cumberland, that is the step on which I must fall down or else overleap, for in my way it lies. Stars, hide your fire. Let not light see my black and deep desire. He admits to himself that he will need to do something terrible to become king, knowing that Malcolm is currently the successor, an obstacle to overcome. The theme that's been shown here is appearance versus reality, things being hidden from sight. You know, what is versus what is not, this idea of hiding from the light. But it is key to point out that he has done all of this himself. It's not Lady Macbeth who manipulates him into doing it. He already wants to. Act 1, Scene 5 is the first introduction of Lady Macbeth, and we see the private side of their relationship behind the courageous warrior. She's very clear on what needs to happen. She's very decisive, and she's aware that her husband is incapable of acting dishonourably. She fears his nature and his sense of human kindness, you know, as if that's a failing, and she fears that he's incapable of killing Duncan, an act that would make her queen. Again, the theme of appearance versus reality appears here. And she very much sounds like one of the witches, the fair is foul and foul is fair speech. So just like Lady Macbeth sees Macbeth's kindness as a weakness, she invokes evil spirits to help her achieve her goals. She crosses over to the dark side. Is she possessed? And later on, she becomes an insomniac. She decides Duncan is to be murdered. Your face, my Thane, is a book where men read strange matters, and she wishes Macbeth to be more covert about his intentions. She tells him to look like the innocent flower but be the serpent underneath it, mirroring the Bible story of Adam and Eve. And, you know, Macbeth says, we will speak further, but she basically tells him, no, I'm in charge here. and she's very much got the control in this scene. She's doing, in her mind, she's doing what a good wife should do. Act 1, Scene 6 is very much the calm before the storm. Duncan arrives at Macbeth's castle and he's unaware of the plotting and the scheming. It's a very deeply ironic scene. He talks about how the castle hath a pleasant seat. The nimbly and sweetly recommends itself into the gentle senses, once again showing his naivety and his ability to see what's in front of him, arguably, which makes him a poor king. And in this final section, he's very much seen as beloved by Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, but ironically they lead him to his own grave. There's very much this sense of dramatic irony. Macbeth at this point is preparing for Duncan's murder, and he's very excited, for that. So, and they're just so duplicitous and big fat liars in this scene. All our service and every point twice done, and then done double. We're poor and single business to contend. All they're bothered about is Duncan's happiness. So they are liars, they are equivocators. Act 1, Scene 7 is a massive scene. This is very much Macbeth's wanting to back out and Lady Macbeth persuading him that it's a great idea. And Macbeth puts up a very logical argument about why he shouldn't kill Duncan. He's aware of the slippery slope of murder. If it were done when 'tis done, then to a well it were done quickly. He wants to get this terrible deed over and done with, like the ripping off a plaster. But this is a double meaning. He could try and kill Duncan as soon as possible, like seize the day. And he wants to very much get it over with because he knows he's going to back out if he thinks of it too longer. There's a real sense of foreshadowing in this scene. He is aware that the murder of Duncan will create a chain of events outside of his control. So he knows the consequences of this action in terms of the great chain of being. He debates it. He gives a great list of reasons why he shouldn't kill Duncan. He's the king, he's a relative, he's a guest, he's a great king who is loved and respected. His murder will cause a terrible reaction from the people of Scotland. He even says he has no good reason to kill Duncan. He has no spur, he has no impetus, or cause, except his ambition. He's almost talked himself out of it, and then Lady Macbeth intervenes. It's a coincidental and significant arrival. Is she to blame for King Duncan's impending murder through coercing Macbeth into it after he's talked himself out of it? Would he have died if she hadn't walked in at this moment? And she is incredibly persuasive. She tackles his inconsistent double-mindedness. She vindictively uses his love for her as a reason to do it. She calls him a drunkard. She challenges his manhood. And that is the main trigger, this idea of masculinity. When you durst do it, then you're a man. Remember, in those days, it was very much about how you were in the battlefield, whether you were manly. His entire reputation is based on his bravery and courage, and he loves her. So Lady Macbeth, calling his manly skill into question and disrepute, cowardice is just the worst for him. He has very little choice in his mind other than to defend himself. And he does panic. He says, if we should fail, what if we fail? And she says, then we fail, we'll do it together. And she tells him to screw his courage to the sticking place and they'll be fine. And he invests in their relationship rather than his relationship with King Duncan. Act 2, Scene 1, we see opens with Banquo and Fleance. So they're up and awake in the courtyard on this very starless night, which seems very strange because remember, both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have called on the stars to hide their fires. So, the way the natural world is representing what's happening, the things in the play. So evil has taken hold. It is now a very dark place at the castle. Banquo admits he's having trouble sleeping. He's very unsettled by the witch's prophecies and he doesn't feel comfortable there. He asks straight away for his sword, and when Macbeth arrives, he said, "Who's there?" He's really showing that he doesn't feel safe. He recognises that things have gone wrong. There's a contrast between Banquo and Duncan. Duncan was very effusive in his praise and lavish in his compliments when he arrives, at the best castle, but Banquo's on guard and on edge. He asks for his sword when he hears someone approaching. He's in his friend's castle where supposedly no harm can come to him, but he's paranoid and suspicious. Macbeth is suggesting something through the subtext: if you shall cleave to my consent when 'tis, it shall make honour of you. He hints at some event in the future, encouraging Banquo's loyalty, but Banquo is very much saying he's loyal to the king. So I lose none in seeking to augment it, but still keep my bosom franchise and allegiance clear. I shall be counselled. You know, he's basically saying I will be compliant as long as I don't lose honour. He knows his role. He knows that he's supposed to be a good person. His troubled state of mind, Macbeth's troubled state of mind, is really shown in, you know, this scene with the "is this the dagger I see before me?" The hallucination of the bloody dagger leading him towards Duncan's room. The dagger is pointing him to the way that he's already going, a fevered mind and mental pressure. Shakespeare uses many metaphors in this scene about hidden identities and false face, and now Banquo is calling on Macbeth to reveal himself. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have called for the stars not to shine on their deeds and hide their intentions. It's very much irreversible from this point on. Darkness has taken hold of their minds and the castle. So Act 2, Scene 2, Macbeth has murdered Duncan off stage. He holds the bloody dagger back on the stage after committing the crime. I've done the deed. He doesn't say murder. He uses different words to avoid that. So are we supposed to sympathise with Macbeth at this point? You know, he was courageous, he was ambitious, and he was, you know, persuaded by these women, the weird sisters and his wife, to become overly ambitious and with schemes of murder of the innocent king, and he goes against decency and morality and but he does go on and kill more people indiscriminately to maintain his ill-gotten gain. It's very difficult to see where the line ends with Macbeth. He killed Duncan because he was manipulated by the witches and Lady Macbeth, but he didn't need to kill Banquo. He didn't need to try and kill Fleance, the Macduffs, the guards, everything else. So eventually, in the end, I think he does recognise the error of his ways and he gets his comeuppance. Lady Macbeth is horrified by him in this scene. She responds with, "Why did you bring the dagger from this place? It must lie there." You know, Macbeth is full of borderline hysterical fear at this point. You know, are we supposed to sympathise with her as well? She says she couldn't murder Duncan. She said he resembled my father as he slept. She couldn't bring herself to do it. It's very difficult at this point. She's asked to be unsexed, but yet that hasn't worked. She's pretending. There's very much the theme of internal conflict here. There's very much confidence and mastery of language from Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, as being seen in the other scenes, but it doesn't exist in this one. They're very, very panicky and on edge. Lots of exclamation marks, hark, peace, showing how troubled they are. Macbeth behaves as if he's in a trance. He appears not to care if he's caught or not, and indulges in self-reproach, while Lady Macbeth desperately tries to bring him round. He's completely fallen apart and it's her job to try and fix it. There's very much a lot of irony in this scene, with Lady Macbeth urging her husband to wash the blood from his hands. A little water cleaves us of this deed, and he talks about Neptune's ocean. And later there's a kind of a cyclical element when we see Lady Macbeth in her final scene washing her hands. The dagger becomes a metaphor for his guilt and kind of points out it wasn't directing him to killing Duncan. It was more of a visual representation of the crime he was about to commit. The fact that he's brought the weapon with him implicates, you know, he'd be caught red-handed, and it's this kind of moment that later haunts her dreams when she's constantly trying to get into bed. She's constantly trying to fix what they've done. The symbolic knocking at the gate by Macduff symbolises the reality outside the castle gate. You know, Macduff is literally coming for him. So the knocking wakes Macbeth and Lady Macbeth from the dark and murderous revelry that they've been involved with. It makes the deed shocking, raw and real, and very much points out their guilt. You know, the guilt is literally knocking at the gate. Act 2, Scene 3 is the Porter scene. It's very much a scene with comic relief. It releases the tension from Duncan's death, but the themes are really important, and the ones that we see throughout the play, this idea of truth and reality, deception, using half-truths to get out of trouble, this idea of being an equivocator.
So, for example, he references the farmer who keeps the grain to himself when others are starving because he believes it will make it more valuable and get a price for it. Next harvest is plentiful and the price of grain plummets and ruins him. It's this idea of an equivocator. So Macbeth has washed hands and changed clothes. When Macduff arrives, "Good morrow both, not yet, I'll bring you to him." He speaks in very short, simple sentences when he asks questions, and this is the one that I very much laugh at because they're talking about how awful the weather was, and he was like, "Oh yeah, it was bad." But he doesn't go into detail, these really short sentences, which shows his state of mind. He's really struggling to concentrate. Before he was talking in this articulate symbolism and soliloquy and metaphor, but now he's very much doomed, and we can see that in his speech. Lady Macbeth is now overwhelmed by negative emotion and she's starting to take Macbeth's place. Macbeth in this scene is much more in control of the situation. Act 2, Scene 4 sees a conversation between Ross and the old man, and it reveals a lot of different things about the natural the natural order. So in the Jacobean era, they believed in this feudalistic natural order: king, noblemen, lords, gentry, landowners, down to the peasants. Any break in this order was considered serious to the natural order. Macbeth commits regicide, the killing of the king, which is a serious breach of the natural order. So the old man and Ross are discussing the happenings in the play outside of the characters, and they talk about how the mousing owl and the falcon were fighting, which is unusual. So these images of the disturbance of nature reflect the huge crime that has been committed against Duncan, a crime so significant that it's affected the balance of nature. The language here is significant because of the way that the old man speaks. He uses natural and severe language, which shows he's superstitious and simple-minded. Ross speaks in an artificial way, which becomes clear when he speaks to Macduff later on. He's never quite telling the truth either. Ross admits his intention to follow the story behind Macbeth, that Duncan's son has murdered his father. He will go to Scone to see Macbeth crowned king. Macduff in this scene signals his uncertainty by saying that he will go home to Fife. Ross understands the story might be untrue. He's following it because he's uncertain of what might happen. Macbeth is not the only one who hides what he knows, so Ross is always playing both sides. He's an equivocator himself, hiding the truth, living a lie. And this is the scene I always mention as well because it talks about how the horses eat the horses. So we can see that the natural order and the nobleness has been usurped, it's been damaged. Act 3, Scene 1 opens with Banquo voicing his suspicion and paranoia about Macbeth. And he's right to be suspicious because Macbeth is already plotting Banquo's murder. So Banquo's soliloquy here, the one that you can see on the left, really highlights his uncertainty. He's not best pleased about how Macbeth has won the throne, and he wonders if a promotion will come his way. So there is a hint that if Banquo had remained alive, that would he have continued to be so innocent? You know, he says, "I fear thou playest most foully for it, but may they not be my oracles as well?" So there's a hint of his ambition creeping in at this point. So throughout the scene, there's very much this richness of language, double meanings and puns and irony. And it's very much an environment for the audience where they are on edge. To be Macbeth's chief guest is to become his victim. So that kind of predicts, you know, who's going to die next. So throughout the speeches, or throughout the play, Macbeth's speeches change in order to reflect his state of mind. In this scene, he's very much a different man to his previous scene. He's very paranoid here. To be thus is nothing but to be safely thus. Our fears in Banquo stick deep, this kind of metaphorical language of how he's going to kill him. You know, he's jealous of him because he feels like he's a natural king and everybody is going to see that Macbeth is faking it if put next to Banquo. Therefore, he convinces himself that he's got to get rid of them. So in this scene, we very much see this kind of him as a warrior, as a panicker, but also this deeply calculating character when he says to Banquo, "Fail not at our feast," and Macbeth Banquo says, "My lord, I will not," you know, highlighting how duplicitous Macbeth is. He plans to kill him, but also how loyal Banquo is. Banquo shows up to the scene, even if he's dead. So we're still tracking Macbeth on his character arc, on his journey from this noble soldier to cajoling to cunning, but now he's very much descended into this paranoia, this mania, and his mask is slipping. We very much see that when Banquo's ghosts come in, which highlights how his deeds have corrupted the person. Act 3, Scene 2 shows the disintegration of the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. You know, the role reversal is now at the point where Lady Macbeth is beginning to feel the strain of their deed, and Macbeth is very much now in control. So he is like still absolutely panicking, saying we've scotched the snake, not killed it, and he's very much wants to carry on murdering people, but she's like, stop it, you must leave this. But he's dominating now, so we can see on the left there how much he's talking compared to how much she's talking. And this is she asks him quite nervously what's to be done, and he's like, "Oh, be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Truck." And she's gone from his dearest partner in greatness to Chuck, like a little pet. So the soliloquies now is very much showing the role reversal. Macbeth is very much his paranoia is mounting, and he talks about how his mind is full of scorpions, and he's worried that they've done it all for nothing and this is pointless. They're both trying to hide their worry and misery from each other, and Macbeth refuses to let Lady Macbeth in on this new plan to kill Banquo. So he's trying to protect her whilst she's rebuking him for being miserable. What's done is done. So both are suffering from insomnia and nightmares and torture of the mind. They're both experiencing the same thing, but they've never been as far apart. So there's a sense of secrecy in this scene. After refusing to let Lady Macbeth on his plan to kill Banquo, their relationship never really recovers, and we don't see her again after the banquet scene. She just disappears. He's locked her out of their partner in crime relationship, and she becomes dependent on him. You know, the controlled Lady Macbeth of Act 2 is gone. She's now haunted, and again it shows the corruption of character and how the great chain of being has to reset itself. Act 3, Scene 3 shows the murderers, and Macbeth has planned to kill both Banquo and Fleance because the witch has told him that Banquo's son would be kings. Macbeth's murder plot shows that he is challenging fate, the same fate that crowned him the Thane of Cawdor and the crown. He wants to outsmart the prophecies. I mean, he can't, but he wants to outsmart him. So the witch's prophecy shows that the real danger is Fleance, so he tries to get rid of Fleance, but he's really paranoid at this point. He sends in a third murderer after the first two that they're not expecting. This shows his lack of trust for anyone, his downward spiral, and actually that causes the problem. Fleance escapes. So Macbeth is very selective at this point. He's so inconsistent and changeable. He believes what he wants to believe, the prophecies that benefit him, yet the prophecies that don't, no, and he tries to challenge them. He's an immature character. He's not a clever and noble man, and he's completely coming apart at the seams. Also, this idea of him playing with fate. If he believes in the same fate that has brought him to this point, his efforts to murder Banquo and Fleance are useless. If he believed the fates made him the king, why does he think he can change the fate of Banquo and Fleance? You know, what's worse, murdering them or trying to counter fate? Both are massive crimes, and it shows very much that he's on his downward spiral. This is kind of the climax of his personality destruction. I am going to do a more detailed video on this scene because it's one that could come up in the exam, and this is where Banquo's ghost appears. And on the left, I've picked the quote, "Which of you have done this?" And he looks around straight away when the ghost appears, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't murder him." So like the dagger, at first he's not sure whether he's real. He thinks he's real, and he immediately passes the blame, which just shows how far he's come. And he's like, "Thou cannot say I did it." He's immediately denying guilt. So the celebration feast was an attempt to endear himself to society. He doesn't sit at the head of the table, he sits amongst the other people, and he's going aboard to make everybody feel welcome. This is the chance for him to create stability in his throne, but he doesn't do that because obviously he loses his mind. He's very confident, and he's not worried about anyone finding out what he's done because the murderer enters just as everyone's seated. Doesn't seem to be overly hiding what he's done. However, he can't sit down with his guests, just as he's unable to stand with them in society. So he doesn't know where his place is. He should be at the head of the table, but he feels like he doesn't fit there. And then when he tries to sit down at the seat he's picked, Banquo's bloody ghost takes his place. There's a real sense of dramatic irony and tension here as he's confronted by an apparition that only he can see. Is this a symptom of his guilt? Is it a hallucination? Is it sent by the witches? That's up to your interpretation. So after conspiring for Banquo's murder, to find his ghost sitting at the table in his seat is profound dramatic irony. Macbeth panics, he becomes hysterical and upsets all his guests, and echoes the prophecy from the witches that Banquo's son will come to the throne. Lady Macbeth very much tries to allay the guests' fears and cover for it, and she tells them that sometimes he behaves like this, there's nothing to worry about. She says, "Sit, my worthy friends, my lord is often thus and had been from his youth," which is really strange because at the time no one would have wanted a mentally ill king, but obviously it's better than realising that he's a murderer. It's a chaotic scene, and despite Macbeth's efforts, the feast ends in disorder and disarray, and it's symbolic of how he's trying to get people on his side to bring society together, but it fails spectacularly. So the reason for his failure are the deeds that he's committed to get to this point. He's never going to be able to create peace. It's very much an escalation scene. They'd hoped just to kill King Duncan and no more, but the crime has opened up a sequence of events where escalating crimes are to be committed. The whole plan is unravelling. Remember, Lady Macbeth doesn't know about Banquo's death though. She's only been involved in Duncan's. This scene very much represents his alienation from society. He attempts to fit in with the noble and lords, however his insanity alienates him, and everything begins to crumble from this point, and he begins to feel that he's alone in the world, and his relationship with Lady Macbeth, has started to fall apart. She tries to rally around him, but then she becomes drained as well. She's very broken, and the only time we see Lady Macbeth after this point is when she's sleepwalking, and Macbeth's murderous tendencies are now increasing, her insanity is increasing, and it's just a disaster. There's just rivers of blood. I'm in blood steps so far that I should wade no more, returning were as tedious as to go over. So they're past the point of no return. Macbeth's murderous nature has grown whilst Lady Macbeth has shrunk, and she's grieving that fact. She's lost her husband. This is the scene I haven't given a lot of weight to in class. It's the Hecate scene, and there's rumours that this scene may have been added by actors rather than Shakespeare himself, because the witches were very popular characters for audience, and Hecate's got many lines, so it's like they've wanted to add a bit of dramaticness into it. The witches appear differently in this scene. They don't really fit, which suggests that weren't written by Shakespeare. They treat Macbeth as the poor victim of their plotting at the beginning, and here they treat him as if they are one of his own. The witch is developing identification with Macbeth. Could be because he's become so evil that he's essentially become one of them, and this is a theory that I've had in class, that it's not Lady Macbeth that's witch-like, it's Macbeth. Remember, these are women with beards, which would fit the theory of Macbeth because he's a man, but he's got feminine qualities. And later on at the end of the play, it said, "They've tied me to the stake, I cannot fly." So potentially, this kind of scene suggests that he has become one of them. Hecate talks about how Macbeth's overconfident has a bearing on the future, and it's very much a foreshadowing and echoing scene of what is to come. Okay, Act 3, Scene 6 is another one of the scenes with the smaller characters commenting on what's going on. We've very much got this theme of regicide coming through. So even though Macbeth killed his predecessor, he is still lawfully the crowned king. So kings and members of the royal family may have watched the play in the Globe Theatre. Shakespeare very much has to be careful with this weighty theme to remove Macbeth from the throne, he has to be completely horrible, and that does play out now. He murders the Macduff, he murders young Seward, and that's very much why Macduff is able to kill him in the end. Macbeth's antagonist Macduff is in England, seeking to help the king there to help remove Macbeth from Scotland, and Macbeth is coming across in this scene as very much this unsympathetic protagonist. He's preparing to move against Macduff's family. This makes it really difficult to have any sympathy for Macbeth whatsoever. His murderous intent has spiralled. His motivation for killing Macduff's family is a structural technique in the narrative from Shakespeare, context and reason for Macbeth, and a device to bring the audience out the claustrophobic mind of Macbeth and back into the reality of the play. So very much this scene is showing how he's completely awful, he's completely evil, and therefore Macduff will be well within his rights to dethrone him, to commit regicide himself. I've not included a section of the scene for this one because it is so massively important. So this is the scene where Macbeth goes back to the witches. So we go back to the three witches and we see this theme of deception and equivocation coming through again, appearance versus reality, this sense of half-truths, metaphorical mass from the witches. They are concocting this spell at the start, putting hideous ingredients into a cauldron, and it echoes Macbeth's banquet where everything fell apart and ended in ruin. The witches prepare their very own special feast, which reflects the evil which has been committed by Macbeth in the play. He enters Act 1 with the witches with bravado and confidence, echoing Hecate's prophecy in Act 3, Scene 5, that Macbeth's overconfidence would bring about his downfall, his hubris, and we very much see that here. This scene is a structural device used by Shakespeare. Macbeth is approaching the witches looking for reassurance and comfort that what he has done will keep him on the throne, and the witches show three different apparitions which Macbeth interprets in his own way. These apparitions, while seeming to comfort him, are entirely deceptive and symptomatic of how the witches speak in riddles and half-truth. The audience are shown a series of apparitions which are supposed to confirm one thing but can be interpreted as the complete opposite. It's a foreshadowing event. Shakespeare is flagging something that will become crucial to the final outcome of the play. So apparition 1, we see the armed head, so the head wearing the helmet, and this one foretells Macbeth's eventual decapitation at the hands of Macduff. Macbeth, however, believes that the head is representative of Macduff. He misunderstands its true meaning, so that one is beware Macduff. He kind of thinks that that head represents him decapitating Macduff, because obviously he's not frightened of anyone at this point. The bloodied child comes through. This again is meant to represent Macduff. Not one who's been born of woman can hurt him. Macbeth again misreads the prophecy, thinking he has nothing to fear, but the bloodied child is Macduff himself. And apparition 3 is Malcolm's son holding the branches, Duncan's son holding the branches, coming to Macbeth's castle carrying a branch from a tree. This idea that Macbeth can't be harmed until Birnam Wood moves to Dunsinane. He again thinks it's impossible for a forest to move, feels even more secure following this prophecy, and Macbeth reads into each of the prophecies and what he wants to see from them. Apparition 4 is the 8 kings, the descendant of Banquo, the final one holding a mirror, showing that there'll be many, many more. And he sees this line of 8 kings who are all descendants of Banquo, and this leaves him in an awful state. And this is his homage, his ambition. He keeps trying to find out more when he should just leave well alone. You know, this reminds him that no one descends from him, and no one from him will inherit the throne. It's curious that Macbeth sees this but still doesn't doubt the early prophecies. The witches have been playing with him. He just again sees what he wants to. He says, like, I don't fear Macduff and I don't need to fear Macduff, and I'm going to kill Macduff anyways. He's very paranoid, but not about the witches, which is strange. So his character is developed at this point. You know, however evil, each murder very much has a purpose, but now he has decided that we'll commit murders on a whim without thought. From this moment, the very first things in my heart should be the first things on my hand. This imagery of hand again. They are now completely covered in blood. He plots to murder Macduff's wife and children in this terrible act. Remember, he knows Macduff is not at home, and this dehumanises him in our eyes. He's now a cold-hearted killing machine. It's difficult to have any sympathy for him or to see him as anything else other than a monster at this point. This is where the last ounce of sympathy that we had for him dissipates. He's now just evil. Arguably the saddest scene in the play, this is where we see the Macduff slaughtered by the murderers. And the audience are expecting this because he's told the audience that this is going to happen, so they're waiting for this to happen. So Lady Macduff tells her son that her father, her husband is a traitor, their father is a traitor, and there's an in-depth conversation between that about the nature of treason and who can be declared treasonous. And this is very much because Macduff is seen as a traitor because he's run away from Macbeth and he's gone to England. However, he's not a traitor because Macbeth's a traitor. So there's a lot of duplicitous going on here. So we see the son murdered, but Macbeth doesn't carry out the deed himself, you know, saying that he could not have brought himself to do it even if he wanted to. However, he does kill young Siegward, who is a child, and this infanticide really shows how evil he's become. It's very much his low point. He's now an out-and-out villain, and the only way to keep him remotely redeemable is that he's not the direct murderer of this young boy. And it ties into this character arc. A tragic play requires that we have some sympathy towards Macbeth, even if it is a tiny amount. We see that in the final scenes when he's talking to Macduff and when Lady Macbeth dies. These are structural ploys to make some sort of elements of sympathy for the central character. This is an interesting scene between Macduff and Malcolm. Malcolm, unlike his father, is completely understands deception, equivocation, appearance versus reality. And in this scene, he lies. He presents himself as a Macbeth-style character, a Machiavellian future king, saying he would in fact be worse than Macbeth for Scotland. And Macduff is absolutely appalled. He's gone to England to save Scotland. I mean, that gets his children killed and his wife. And he's met with Malcolm, who presents himself as this awful king. And it's one of the longest scenes in the whole play. And it establishes the character who is big and strong enough to tackle Macbeth. So Malcolm is saying he's awful, but he is the rightful king. And Macduff calls him out and says, fit to govern, no, not to live. It shows himself as really strong. The conversation between them serves a number of purposes. Malcolm, in contrast to his father, is showing immense caution and is testing Macduff to see if he can trust him. You know, to show an unfelt sorrow is an office which the false man does easy. Lady Macbeth had previously chided Macbeth and showing his face like a book, and Macbeth becomes more duplicitous after this, but Malcolm is able to hide his face to protect his country. So there's a suggestion that Macbeth has sent his spies to try and trick Malcolm, and if he comes back to Scotland, he'll be killed by Macbeth. So therefore, he's checking whether Macduff is a traitor. This scene is critical of Scotland and also what a good king should be like. Malcolm denounces himself as greedy, violent, and lustful in an effort to gauge Macduff's reactions. If he were to be king, he would pour the sweet milk of concord into hell upon the universe of peace and confound all the unity on earth. He's saying he would be worse than Macbeth. At this point, Macduff is at his wit's end. And this is a subtle way of describing Scotland's state under Macbeth's rule. Men's actions can disrupt the natural order, which can result in disruptions in nature. Malcolm is describing a country completely ruined and miserable, and this is precisely what Macbeth's Scotland really is. Obviously, he's lying and he reveals that, but he is being a much better king than his father ever was. So Malcolm goes on to say that he's none of the things that evil kings he's described are. He then describes what a good king is and references Edward the Confessor. People perceived that kings had miraculous healing abilities. They were supernaturally defied. Edward the Confessor, King James related, Shakespeare is trying to present the king in a good light. Edward is gentle and noble. Macbeth is murderous and barbaric. There are contrasts. The cycle of murder continues because at this point Macduff learns that his family have been murdered and he's totally emotionally overwrought by this, which really contrasts Macbeth's she would have died hereafter speech later on. Macduff and Malcolm now seem like convincing characters with the task of dethroning the tyrant Macbeth. Together they're going to make a fantastic team. We've done Act 5, Scene 1 in detail, and this is the scene where Lady Macbeth has lost her mind. So in previous acts, she seems completely untroubled by the evil and the supernatural. In Act 3, the dead are but as pictures, but she is now walking and talking in her sleep, a sign of madness. So in this scene, she seems lost, she's gone beyond her humanity, and the guilt and stress on her mind is too much to bear. Earlier, she convinced Macbeth to kill Duncan by attacking his manhood, but now Macbeth says, I dare do all that may become a man. Who dares do more is none. Anyone who kills a king is not a man, because they've lost their humanity. There's an analogy by D.J. Enright that Lady Macbeth is a sprinter in evil, whilst Macbeth is a long-distance runner. He starts off slowly but goes for much longer. She falls at the first hurdle. So this is reinforced through Shakespeare's repetition and imagery. Lady Macbeth's soliloquy repeatedly focuses on blood and murder. Who would have thought that the old man would have had so much blood in him? Earlier, she believes that washing your hands of the blood would remove the deed from your mind. However, she is learning the hard way of the toll these deeds have had on her. It's stained her soul. So there's multiple meanings of the famous quotation, out, damn spot. Interpretation 1, she's unable to literally wash the blood from her hands or figuratively clean the guilt from her mind. Interpretation 2, she may be possessed by demons. Demons and witches were often known to have had certain spots on their body which marked them out as evil. Out is a symbol that she's trying to get her soul back. However, she has a price to pay for the crime she's committed. Her suicide, her fate is the final nail in the coffin for a relationship with Macbeth. After she dies, committing suicide, he is alone. There is also the suggestion that he's already alone and her death means nothing to him, which we've talked about in class in great detail. Act 5, Scene 2 is again one of the minor characters, giving us a bit of extra detail. So there's an extended metaphor throughout this scene of the attire, clothes and garments that don't fit appear. So Angus refers to Macbeth as a dwarf wearing a giant's robes. Again, we can take this to mean that Duncan, as a good king, was a giant, while Macbeth in his place is a dwarf. This will be a good one for us to look at when we talk about kingship, so we'll be doing a video on that. I feel this means more about the stature rather than any literal sense of size. So it's a metaphor saying that Macbeth is wearing borrowed robes. They don't fit him because he's not strong enough, he's not manly enough. Certainly, as the play draws to its conclusion, we begin to see the final version of Macbeth, and he is not hiding. That shows the internal conflict. So over the next few scenes, as the forces amass against him, Macbeth faces internal turmoil. The building forces outside his castle are a mere distraction to his own thoughts. The audience is being guided in the direction of Macbeth's own thoughts and feelings rather than putting too great a stop in the battle which is due to happen. There's a real sense of suspense in this scene, as Shakespeare makes another interesting structural decision here that enhances the impact of the final scenes. From Act 4, Scene 3, when Macduff and Malcolm decide to join the forces to overthrow Macbeth, until the end of the play, Shakespeare tends to contrast the scene of the good guys planning their attack with the scene where we see Macbeth in emotional turmoil. Through this, we see the liberating army steadily move towards Macbeth's castle, while we see Macbeth himself steadily descending into despair. So as they gather strength, he becomes increasingly weak. The theme of hubris is referenced again, so while Macbeth believes himself to be invincible, we see that his real enemy is his conscience. He is suffering the weight of the decisions he has made, and he acts as he is carried out. The armies gathering outside his castle are inconsequential and annoyance at best. The real battle is within his mind and soul. The doctor appears to tell Macbeth that Lady Macbeth is not very well, and again we've got this metaphor of illness. So following Macbeth's internal monologues, we see that the strain is beginning to show. The doctor comes and tells about Lady Macbeth and how he is suffering, and he simply tells him to treat the illness, like just sort it out. There's an analogy here, and he invokes the analogy here of asking the doctor if he can treat a sick country. So he compares Lady Macbeth to that of Scotland, which echoes and furthers Shakespeare's metaphor from the scene in the English court with the doctor there, and about how Malcolm heals and helps the sick people in his country, while here in Scotland we'll have to assume that the entire country is sick. It is a result of Macbeth himself: mood swings, rage, disgust, misery, determination. So So Scotland is ill because the wrong person is leading. Macbeth decides to face the invader single-handedly till from my bones my flesh be hacked. Shakespeare's trying to get the audience to have some admiration for him, logistically speaking. He's still a brave warrior, although maybe not noble anymore. He's now ruined, he's left with only one option, face him like a man, like the great warrior we saw at the beginning, trying to redeem himself. Act 5, Scene 4 reveals that the prophecies are coming true, or even though Macbeth thinks, well, you know what I mean. So they say cut down from the bough from the trees. The audience realises that the Dunsinane, the forest, is moving. So Macbeth believed wholeheartedly in the witch's prophecies, even though he tried to get rid of Banquo and Fleance. And another one is coming true in an unfortunate way. His bravery and determination is misplaced. He believes himself to be invincible. The witches are cunning in the deception towards Macbeth, who is highly impressionable. The tragic denouement is imminent and inevitable. You know, he is about to die. We talked about this a lot in class, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. She should have died hereafter. It's got multiple meanings. Either Macbeth knew that Lady Macbeth would die anyway because of what they'd done, or it symbolises the complete breakdown of their relationship, or her dying is an annoyance and a distraction as he plans a battle, or perhaps he would have killed her, or perhaps she shouldn't have died yet. She should have died at a later date in its guilt. This is the one that I interpret, that this is the moment he becomes very nihilistic. Her death, you know, means what's the point of all this anymore? So he then goes on to talk about the tomorrow, and the tomorrow. He speaks about the trivial nature of life that is essentially worthless. She is the candle that was brief and it's now out and his life is over, and he realizes that this whole thing has just been a performance. Okay, we're almost there. So in Acts 5, Scene 6, the battle begins when the troops throw down their branches, and then in Scene 7, Macbeth joins the fray. He's determined and fierce like a bear, tied to a stake, pursued by savage dogs. He has not figured out the true meaning of the witch's prophecy about Macduff yet, being not born of woman. Siward wants to make a name for himself and kill Macbeth. Macbeth kills him easily. It's an honourable death for Siward, who was attacked from the front, fought an honourable battle and died an honourable death, valour and bravery in a violent and vicious world. But he is young Siward, he's a young man, he's a child. So again, this kind of takes all our sympathy away from Macbeth. The battlefield, the setting of the play is dangerous and violent. Macbeth is heralded at the beginning of the play for killing lots of people, but is unacceptable because it was on the battlefield, the enemies of Scotland. When he goes on killing the wrong sort of people become concerned, unbalancing the natural order. There's ambiguous loyalty shown in this scene. The suggestion of Macbeth's soldiers are either not fighting very hard or have joined the other side. Malcolm says, "We've met with foes who strike beside us." There's an emphasis on how alone Macbeth is now, Macbeth against the world, but he can't possibly win. Theme of courage versus cowardice is shown here. Macbeth says, "Why should I play the Roman fool and die on my own sword?" He is thinking about suicide, but he doesn't want to go down that route. He does feel guilt at this point, though. There's a glimmer of the goodness in him. He has guilt about killing Macduff's families, and in an attempt to remedy this by telling him that he does not want to shed any more of his blood. I always think that he becomes more human once Lady Macbeth dies, because he realises what he's lost, and therefore he recognises that in Macduff. Macbeth also still believes that he can't be defeated by anyone born of woman. It's misplaced confidence, but he doesn't want to fight Macduff. He doesn't want to kill him. So the final deception's revealed. Macduff was cut from his mother's womb by caesarean rather than born naturally, and this news devastates Macbeth. This was the sole thing that his confidence was based on. His first instinct is to run and not fight with thee. After being goaded by Macduff, he becomes the warrior Macbeth once again, showing the cyclical structure of the play, and he chooses to die fighting rather than be captured and humiliated. But I think at this point he knows he's going to lose. Macbeth is forced by taunting and bullying Lady Macbeth and Macduff by challenging his manhood. Shakespeare very much presents Macbeth as Scotland's best warrior, celebrated by his king and loved and respected by his peers. Through ambition, weakness and influence of others, he threw it all away. He lost parts of his humanity and ends up completely alone to face his own death. In the end, can we have any sympathy for him? Was he wholly responsible for his actions? Was Lady Macbeth the main influence and facilitator? What about the witches? Were they just bystanders in the decline and fall of Macbeth? Those are questions that you need to be able to answer for yourself. What do you think? What's your interpretation? Okay, so finally, at 5 scene 9, the king is dead, Macbeth has been killed, his head has been cut off, and everyone gathers around to celebrate. Order has been restored in Scotland. It was disrupted by Macbeth, and now Malcolm is about to become king, which restores Duncan's line back to the throne. Macbeth is the driving force of the narrative, and his death leaves a void in the final scene, which is also almost anticlimactic, which is intentionally so. The final words of the play, Macbeth is referred to as a butcher, which contrasts his heroic entrance in Act 1. This tragic, regressive character arc, good man with a flaw who ultimately ends up dead. It's very or sympathetic, the good guy led astray, or a bad guy who took advantage of villainous influences, Lady Macbeth and witches. It's up to you to decide what your final interpretation of the play is.